Next, we're going to look at setting up some AOVs in our renders, which stands for arbitrary output variables, and that's just a fancy way of saying render passes. In the previous video where I talked about some of the render view options here, I mentioned that this drop down here has all of your current AOVs available. And right now we really only have our beauty pass, which is our main color channel. And we can add additional AOVs by going to our redshift drop in the out context and the output tab and then AOV. And you can add AOVs by hitting this plus button here. And Redshift comes with a whole bunch of presets that you can use to create information about various parts of your image here. So you can have information about the diffuse lighting, the specular component, reflections, refractions, emission light, global illumination, etc., etc. And we're not going to go super deep into all of these different AOVs here. For this project, I didn't really get as granular as rebuilding the beauty from the diffuse and specular components and etc. I've only added a couple basic AOVs here that can give us some more flexibility in compositing when working on top of the beauty renders. And certainly feel free to investigate all of these AOVs that you have available, and you can play around with perhaps using them in compositing as well. But I'm just going to focus on a few of them for now. And one of the most common AOVs that you'll want to add is the Z depth. So if you click on that one and open up the depth drop down here, this gives us a couple different modes for our Z depth pass. I believe this default depth mode might be an absolute Z depth from the camera, but typically I like to use a normalized depth myself. And we can look at the standard Z depth mode first. So if we rerun our IPR render here, right now this IPR render is going to do a progressive render. You can see this is sampling the entire image, and it's casting additional samples to refine that as the render runs. Now, when we use this progressive IPR sampling mode, if you try to look at your AOVs, then they're not going to give you anything. And this is not something that's super obvious when you first start working in Redshift. I mentioned this in some of the earlier videos. You have to use the bucket mode if you want to see your AOVs in the render view here. So you can turn on bucket mode with this icon here. You can see those buckets are getting to work, and the default bucket pattern will spiral out from the center. And now we can see our Z depth pass here. This looks a little bit strange. I think this depth mode of defaulting to Z might just be absolute Z depth values. And I always prefer to use the normalized options, which will remap these depths from black to white. And this is going to use the camera near and far clipping planes. Let's re-render this current image here before we start tweaking our near and far distances. And you can see now that we've set up a normalized pass, this is giving us something that's much more coherent. This is giving us a black to white image, and you can see the depth more usefully represented in this visible black to white range. Of course, you can invert that as well if you'd like. If for your own personal preferences, you prefer to have the white closer to camera and the black further away. And for now, I'll just stick with this standard Z normalized option here. And you can see that by default, this is using the near and far clipping planes that are set on the camera itself. Now I'm going to take a snapshot of this here, and we can adjust those clipping ranges to give us a more clearly defined range exactly where we need it. So let's add that snapshot, and I'll stop the IPR render for the moment, minimize that view, and back to the object context. And then if you select the camera and go to the View tab, you can see that the default near and far clipping planes are super close to camera and super far away. So we can start modifying these clipping planes to figure out what distances correspond to roughly the start and end of our environment here. So if I set the clipping bar plane to 500, that's not nearly far enough. 5,000 is too far, and then of course we can just dial this in a bit. As we bring in that clipping plane, you can see that it's also clipping off the Houdini grid, so that might help you to see how close you're getting. And it looks like 800 is starting to clip off the environment a bit. Looks like 900 is including pretty much everything. 1000 looks pretty safe, and we don't want to put our camera clipping planes right at the very, close and far extremes. We want to give a little bit of breathing room here. So I'm just going to extend this a couple hundred units beyond what I already think is going to be a safe far clipping point. And then we can do a similar thing for the near clipping point. And you can see as we reduce this range, it's also affecting the quality of our viewport display. Now, this OpenGL viewport has limitations, and when you have a more limited Z range that the camera's working in, you can see this becomes a bit more accurate as we narrow that down. So 0.001, we're having some issues with our display, especially in the water area. And even just turning that clipping up to 1 gives us a better viewport display here. But I'm going to turn this up quite a bit more to figure out at what point the environment starts to get clipped off. So 700 is a bit too far. Looks like 500 is getting pretty safe. But once again, to give this a little bit of breathing room, I'm going to turn the near clipping plane down to 300. And now if we do a fresh render of our scene here with the modified near and far clipping planes on that camera, then you'll see that this black to white range has been updated. And you don't need to worry about getting a very precise black to white range out of this Z-depth pass, because you can just remap this in your compositing software and adjust the values there. And if you look back at the AOV preset underneath the common dropdown on the Z-depth settings, you can see that this Z-depth preset stores this as a 32-bit float, which is a decimal value with a lot of precision. If you were storing this with less bit depth, then you could potentially run into more limitations with how far you can push the remapping of these values. But with these 32-bit values, you have a lot of freedom to adjust that in compositing without running into artifacts. Now, it's also worth pointing out that this Z-depth pass is different from deep rendering and deep compositing. And in this course, we're not really going to get into deep rendering or compositing, but if you go to this AOV processing tab, you can see that you can enable deep output, which will essentially render lots of extra slices of information in your image. And it stores rendered data at various depths throughout this entire image, and it gives you a lot of flexibility in compositing that standard rendering does not. And I know that's kind of a poor, very broad description of what deep rendering and compositing does. I encourage you to look into that a little bit more. It's kind of outside the scope of this class, but it can be quite helpful and flexible to use in some cases. And the only real downside of using deep renders and composites is that it makes the renders extremely heavy. It's a ton of data to store, and it tends to slow down things on the compositing side as well, because it is a lot of data for your compositing program to handle. Another AOV that's common to include is an ID pass for different elements in the scene. So for example, the creatures could be colored pure red, the ground could be pure green, water could be pure blue, and this would allow us to use those IDs to isolate specific parts of the image in compositing to process them separately. And we have a few different ways that we can set this up in Redshift, And one of the easiest and most convenient ways is to use the puzzle mat. So let's add another AOV here, and under AOV type, let's select the puzzle mat and open up the puzzle mat options. And you can see that this has an ID parameter for each of the red, green, and blue channels of the image. And this is pretty nice because you can store whatever you want in those RGB channels, and it's a very convenient way to package up a few different IDs. And if there are more elements that you want to provide ID passes for than you have RGB channels available, you can just make a second puzzle mat pass for those additional elements. And the puzzle mats can work either on material IDs or object IDs. Personally, I usually just use the object IDs, but I'll show you where the material IDs are defined as well. If you go to the material context and then go to your RS material builder, you can see you have a material ID available right here. So if you want the rocks to, for example, show up in the blue channel of the puzzle mat, you could set some specific material ID on here, perhaps set that to 4. And then if we go to our redshift ROP once again, we can set the blue ID equal to 4, which matches the material ID that we specified on the rocks shader. And this would give us a puzzle mat based on that material. But I'm not going to do that. Like I said, I typically use object IDs myself, so I'll flip that to object ID. Let's go to the object context, and then let's zoom in on our render objects here. Now each of these geometry objects has a default object ID of 0, and for these puzzle mats I always change this from the default. So on the render env, I'll set that to 1, I'll set the rocks to 2, for the water I'll make that 3, and the creatures I'll set that to 4. So now if we go back to the redshift ROP and go back to our object ID parameters for the puzzle mat, we can change these parameters to match the IDs we just set. So I'll put 1 in the red, 2 in the green, 3 in the blue. And let's open up our render view and re-render this. And now after re-rendering, you'll see we have a puzzle mat AOV in our drop down here. And if you take a look at that, sure enough, you have your RGB channels matching the objects selected with the IDs that you put in the redshift ROP parameters. Now, because we're limited to 3 different object IDs here, and multiple objects can share the same ID. If you wanted the rocks to be included in the red ID color with the rest of the environment, you could specify the same ID number for both the rocks and the terrain. It doesn't have to be a unique ID per object. But let's say we want to include more than 3 different things. We can do that easily enough by adding another puzzle mat AOV. So let's go to our redshift ROP, hit the plus for an additional AOV here. And once again, we'll select the puzzle mat, and we have to give this a different name. You can see by default, they're both called puzzle mat, so this won't work. It'll only recognize one of these when you render it. So I'll call the second one puzzle mat B. And then if you open up the puzzle mat parameters, we can specify the ID for the creatures in one of these channels. So let's put a 4 for that creature object ID in the red channel. And you have to be careful because the new puzzle mat is defaulting to material ID. So if you don't change that, this second puzzle mat won't work. So flip that to object ID as well. And let's re-render this. Now as this re-renders, you can see no change in our first puzzle mat AOV here, but if you flip to puzzle mat B, you can see we now have IDs for the creatures. And this is a very convenient way for us to create lots of easily customizable ID passes. And I won't pretend to be a compositing expert, but my understanding is also that these puzzle mat passes, because they're stored in unique RGB channels, this prevents issues with aliasing of overlapping objects blending with each other. Because if you just have one channel with mix of objects in it, then as those objects blend together, especially if they're motion blurred or something, then there can be some issues with extracting that information when it's not in a clean RGB pass. And now another popular way of handling some IDs is to add a Cryptomatte pass. So if you add an AOV here, let's add this fourth one, and then scroll down to that and select the Cryptomatte. Then this Cryptomatte will create unique IDs for all of the different render objects in the scene automatically. You don't have to worry about specifying object IDs or anything. This will just figure it out all on its own, and it's very quick to set up in that regard. And if you look at the drop down here, we can select the Cryptomatte, and you can see we now have some automatic different IDs for all the different objects. And one thing that's worth noting on these Cryptomattes is that Redshift will store this in a completely separate image from your primary render image with its AOVs. The Cryptomatte is in a different file entirely. So if we go to, under the Output tab, go to Common, let's set a render directory for when we render this to disk. I'll go to Job and Render, and I'll create a folder called Wide for this wide shot, and I'll name this render file Beauty with IDs $F3 because we're only going up through frame 240 here, so we only need 3 digits of padding .exr, and accept that. And I'm just going to render this current frame to disk so that we can see what this looks like with those separate Cryptomatte passes. And by default, when we render this to disk, you can see render to mplay is selected, so you'll see that pop up in our mplay while it's rendering. And as this preview shows up in mplay here, you'll see that we don't have access to any of the AOVs in this mplay preview, but don't worry, those AOVs are available to us in the actual rendered files on disk. So if we take a look at those output files and open this Beauty with IDs EXR file, now you can see that we do have this image with all of those ID passes intact. Puzzle Mat 1 and 2, we've got our depth pass as well, but you'll see that we don't have the Cryptomatte available in our Beauty with IDs EXR here. And looking back at our output files, you can see we have a separate Cryptomatte EXR, and if you open that up, you'll see that this matches what we saw in the preview and the Redshift render view in Houdini, but it's just in a different file once this is output to disk. It's just kind of a matter of convenience where they add it to our drop-down list within the Redshift render view here. You do have to sometimes use some special tools to use those Cryptomattes in compositing. It's not necessarily as straightforward as just using an RGB channel. And I'm not really going to get into compositing with Cryptomattes. That's something that I encourage you to look into on your own. I didn't bother using it for this project, but just wanted to point that out as another quick and easy way of creating some ID passes.